The Texas Panhandle in 1884 stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Heat waves danced across the prairie grass like liquid silver, and the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence were the distant lowing of cattle and the rhythmic creak of windmill blades turning in the hot breeze. Marcus Mac Sullivan wiped sweat from his forehead as he surveyed the disaster that had befallen his ranch. 23 head of prime longhorn cattle were missing, along with his prize-breeding bull Thunder, a magnificent animal worth more than most men earned in 2 years. The rustlers had struck during the night, moving the herd with the kind of skill that spoke of professional thieves rather than opportunistic drifters. At 42, Mac was a man carved from the same hard material as the land he worked. His weathered face bore the lines of 2 decades spent under the merciless Texas sun, and his gray eyes held the steady determination of someone who had built everything he owned through sweat, blood, and stubborn refusal to quit. His ranch, the Double S, was modest by Texas standards but represented a lifetime of careful planning and backbreaking work. The tracks left by the rustlers told a troubling story. Mac could read sign well enough to follow a trail, but these thieves had covered their tracks with the expertise of men who understood that their lives depended on not being found. The trail disappeared into rocky ground after only a few miles, leaving Mac staring at barren stone and wondering how he was going to recover a fortune in livestock without professional help. That help arrived 3 days later in a form Mac had never expected or wanted. He was sitting on his porch in the evening, nursing a cup of coffee and contemplating the ruin of his financial security, when a rider appeared on the western horizon. As the figure drew closer, Mac felt his hand instinctively move toward the Winchester rifle, leaning against his chair. The rider was clearly Apache, sitting his horse with the fluid grace that marked the finest horseman on the continent, his long black hair flowing behind him like a war banner. But this was no raiding warrior from the stories that filled Eastern newspapers. The man who dismounted at Mac's fence line was perhaps 30 years old, dressed in a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and practical frontier gear. His deerskin vest was decorated with intricate beadwork, but he wore denim pants and boots that had seen hard use. Most striking were his eyes, intelligent, alert, and holding none of the hostility Mac had expected. "Good evening," the Apache said in perfect English, his voice carrying only the slightest accent. "I am Joseph Walking Bear. I believe you have need of my services." Mac studied the stranger with the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust easily. "And what services might those be?" "I track things that are lost. Animals, people, objects of value." Joseph's dark eyes met Mac's steadily. "Word has spread that Marcus Sullivan of the Double S Ranch has lost cattle to thieves who know how to hide their trail." The casual use of his full name and ranch designation sent a chill down Mac's spine. If this Apache knew those details, he was connected to an information network far more sophisticated than most white settlers realized existed among the tribes. "You hear a lot of things for someone who supposedly lives out in the wilderness," Mac observed carefully. Joseph smiled, and Mac was surprised to see genuine humor in the expression rather than the stoic mask he associated with Apache warriors. "The wilderness is not empty, Mr. Sullivan. It is full of people who see and hear and remember. Your cattle were taken 3 nights ago by 5 men riding shod horses. They moved the herd northwest toward the Caprock, but they did not continue in that direction." The accuracy of Joseph's information was unsettling, but also encouraging. If this man really could track the rustlers, Mac might have a chance of recovering his livestock before they were sold or slaughtered. "Let's say I believe you can find my cattle," Mac said slowly. "What would your fee be?" "I do not work for money," Joseph replied, settling into a comfortable squat that suggested he was prepared for a long conversation. "I work for favors, debts of honor that may be called in at future times." Mac felt his suspicions deepen. In his experience, people who claimed not to want money usually wanted something far more expensive. "What kind of favors?" "The kind that a white rancher with connections to banks, territorial officials, and railroad companies might be able to provide to Apache people who sometimes need help navigating the bureaucracy of your government." It was a surprisingly sophisticated request, and Mac found himself reassessing this man who spoke like an educated diplomat while dressed like a frontier scout. "You're not just a tracker, are you?" Joseph's expression grew more serious, revealing glimpses of the burdens and responsibilities he carried. "I am many things to many people, Mr. Sullivan. To my people, I am a bridge between the old ways and the new world we must learn to inhabit. To white officials, I am a useful source of information about Apache movements and intentions. To men like you, I am someone who can find things that others cannot. The honesty of the answer impressed Mac despite his natural caution. Here was a man who understood the complex realities of frontier life, who had found ways to serve multiple communities without betraying any of them. And you think you can find my cattle? I know I can find your cattle. The question is whether you are prepared to accept help from an Apache, and whether you are willing to owe a debt of honor to someone your people have been taught to consider an enemy. Mac looked out at his empty pastures, thinking about the years of work that had gone into building his herd and the financial disaster that awaited him if the cattle were not recovered. He had always prided himself on solving his own problems, but some problems were bigger than pride. How long would it take? He asked. Joseph stood with the fluid motion of someone completely at home in his own body. We leave at dawn. With good weather and better luck, we should have your cattle back within a week. You know your cattle. You know which brands have been altered and which animals have been sold to innocent buyers. I know how to follow trails that others cannot see. Joseph walked back toward his horse with unhurried confidence. Together, we might accomplish what neither could do alone. As Mac watched the Apache rider disappear into the gathering dusk, he realized that he had just agreed to partner with a man who represented everything he had been raised to fear and distrust. But something about Joseph walking bare suggested that this partnership might teach him more than just how to track stolen cattle. It might teach him that the world was more complex and interconnected than he had ever imagined. Dawn came with the promise of another scorching day, but Mac found himself oddly energized as he prepared for the journey ahead. He had spent a restless night thinking about Joseph walking bare's proposition, and had concluded that he had little choice but to trust the Apache tracker if he wanted any hope of recovering his cattle. Joseph arrived precisely at sunrise, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies and equipment that spoke of extensive experience in long-range tracking. His horse was a beautiful paint stallion that moved with the same fluid grace as its rider, and Mac couldn't help but admire the obvious bond between man and animal. You travel light, Mac observed as he finished saddling his own mount, a sturdy bay gelding named Courage. Speed is more important than comfort when tracking thieves, Joseph replied, checking his rifle and the traditional Apache bow that hung beside his saddle. Every hour we delay gives them more time to sell your cattle, or hide them where we cannot recover them. As they rode out from the ranch, Mac found himself studying his unexpected partner with growing curiosity. Joseph rode with the effortless skill of someone who had learned horsemanship as a child, but his equipment and tactics showed clear evidence of military training. His rifle was a new Winchester, his ammunition was carefully organized, and his approach to route planning demonstrated strategic thinking that went beyond simple tracking skills. Where did you learn to speak English so well? Mac asked, as they followed the cold trail northwest across the prairie. Mission school in New Mexico, then 2 years at the Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Joseph's voice carried no emotion as he recounted what must have been a difficult period of cultural adjustment. The government believes that education will make Apache people more manageable. And what do you believe? Joseph was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon for signs that Mac couldn't see. I believe that knowledge is power, regardless of where it comes from. Apache children who understand both the old ways and the new world will be better equipped to survive what is coming. The trail they followed was invisible to Mac's eyes, but Joseph read the landscape like a book written in a language Mac had never learned. He pointed out disturbances in the grass that indicated the passage of cattle, identified the individual hoofprints of the rustlers' horses, and even predicted where the thieves would have stopped to rest based on his understanding of water sources and defensible camping spots. There, Joseph said around midday, pointing toward a cluster of cottonwood trees beside a dry creek bed. They camped there the first night. 5 men, as I said, and they were confident enough to build a fire. Mac studied the location and saw nothing but trees and grass. But when they reached the spot, Joseph quickly identified the remains of a cold campfire, areas where horses had been picketed, and even discarded food scraps that told him about the rustlers' supplies and likely destination. They're not local men, Joseph concluded after examining the evidence. Their equipment is too good, their planning too careful. These are professional cattle thieves, probably part of a larger organization that moves stolen livestock across territorial lines. The implications were sobering. If they were dealing with organized criminals rather than opportunistic rustlers, recovering the cattle would be far more dangerous than Mac had anticipated. Are you having second thoughts? Joseph asked, Perhaps sensing Mac's concerns, Mac considered the question seriously. He was riding across the Texas prairie with an Apache tracker in pursuit of professional criminals who would certainly kill them both if they were discovered. It was probably the most dangerous thing he had ever done voluntarily. "No," he said finally. "Those cattle represent 20 years of my life. I'm not giving them up without a fight." Joseph nodded approvingly. "Good, because the trail is getting fresher, and I think we will catch up with them tomorrow." That evening, as they made their own camp in a hidden arroyo that provided both water and concealment, Mac found himself drawn into conversation with his companion in ways he had never expected. Joseph was remarkably well-read, equally comfortable discussing Apache oral traditions and the political complexities of territorial governance. He had opinions about everything from cattle breeding to railroad expansion, and his perspectives were informed by a unique understanding of how different cultures approach the same problems. "You're not what I expected," Mac admitted as they shared a dinner of beans and hardtack around their small fire. "What did you expect?" Mac felt slightly embarrassed by the stereotypes that had shaped his preconceptions. "I suppose I expected someone more warlike, less civilized." Joseph's smile held no offense, only the patient amusement of someone who had encountered such assumptions many times before. "And I expected a Texas rancher to be more suspicious of Apache people, less willing to accept help from traditional enemies. Maybe we're both more complicated than our reputations suggest. Perhaps. Or perhaps the world is changing, and men who can adapt to those changes will prosper while those who cannot will be left behind." As they settled in for the night, Mac found himself thinking about Joseph's words and what they might mean for his own future. The frontier was indeed changing, with railroads bringing new settlers and new ways of doing business. Men who could navigate those changes successfully would need to be flexible, open-minded, and willing to form alliances with people they might once have considered enemies. Looking across the dying fire at the Apache tracker who was risking his life to help recover stolen cattle, Mac began to suspect that this partnership might be the beginning of something much larger and more significant than either of them had originally imagined. The second day of tracking brought them into broken country, where mesas and canyons created a landscape perfect for hiding stolen cattle or ambushing pursuers. Joseph's skills became even more impressive as he followed sign across rocky ground that would have stymied most trackers, reading the story of their quarry in disturbed pebbles, scraped rocks, and the subtle patterns left by animals under stress. "They're pushing the herd hard," Joseph observed as they paused at the rim of a shallow canyon. "Harder than they should if they want to keep the cattle healthy for sale." Mac studied the terrain below, noting the narrow trail that wound between towering rock walls. Could be they know they're being followed. Possible. More likely they have a deadline to meet a buyer waiting at a specific location, or a railroad car scheduled to carry the cattle east to market. The implications were troubling. If the rustlers were working to a timeline, they might be willing to take greater risks to avoid capture. That could make them more dangerous, but it could also make them more predictable. As they descended into the canyon, Joseph suddenly raised his hand in a signal for silence. His horse came to an immediate stop, and Mac followed suit, straining his ears for whatever sound had caught the tracker's attention. Then he heard it, the distant lowing of cattle, carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the canyon system. Mac felt his heart race with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. After 2 days of following Cold Trail, they had finally caught up with their quarry. Joseph dismounted and moved forward on foot, gesturing for Mac to follow. They left their horses ground-tied and crept toward the sound, using rocks and brush for concealment as they worked their way closer to what they hoped would be Mac's stolen herd. What they found exceeded Mac's worst fears and best hopes simultaneously. His cattle were penned in a natural corral formed by canyon walls and a makeshift fence, but they were sharing the space with at least 60 other head bearing a variety of brands from ranches across Texas and New Mexico. This wasn't just a simple rustling operation, it was a major criminal enterprise that had been stealing livestock on an industrial scale. "Jesus," Mac whispered, as he recognized not just his own cattle but animals he had seen at recent cattle auctions. "There's a fortune in livestock down there." Joseph nodded grimly. "And enough armed men to protect it." Mac counted at least 8 men visible in the camp, all well armed and positioned with the casual competence of experienced criminals. Their equipment was good, their horses were fast, and their leader, a tall man with a gray beard and the bearing of a former cavalry officer, was clearly someone who understood both strategy and tactics. "We can't take them," Mac said reluctantly. "Not just the 2 of us against 8 armed men in a defensible position." "No," Joseph agreed. "But we can gather evidence and bring back help. and we can make sure they don't move the cattle before the authorities arrive." It was a sensible plan, but Mac found himself reluctant to leave his cattle in the hands of thieves for even another day. 20 years of work was penned in that canyon, and every hour of delay increased the risk that the animals would be moved to a location where recovery would be impossible. "There might be another way," Joseph said thoughtfully, studying the layout of the camp and the natural features of the canyon. "What kind of other way?" Joseph pointed toward the high walls of the canyon, where narrow ledges and ancient handholds offered potential climbing routes for someone with the right skills and motivation. "Apache warriors have used these canyons for generations. There are ways in and out that white men do not know about." Mac followed Joseph's gaze and felt his stomach lurch at the prospect of climbing those sheer rock faces. "You're talking about going down there? Into their camp?" "I am talking about creating enough confusion to scatter the cattle, while you position yourself to drive your animals back toward home." Joseph's dark eyes held the calm intensity that Mac was learning to associate with carefully considered plans. "If we can stampede the herd and create chaos in their camp, we might be able to recover your cattle and escape before they can organize a pursuit." It was an audacious plan that depended on perfect timing, Apache climbing skills, and more luck than Mac was comfortable counting on. It was also probably their only chance of recovering the cattle without waiting for help that might arrive too late. "When?" Mac asked, surprised to hear himself agreeing to such a dangerous scheme. "Tonight, when the moon sets and darkness is deepest." Joseph began sketching a rough map in the dirt, showing Mac the positions they would need to take and the timing that would make their desperate gamble possible. "You will need to be in position to drive the cattle through the canyon mouth when I create the distraction. Once they start moving, do not stop for anything. Drive them hard until you reach open country, then head straight for your ranch." "What about you? How do you get out after you've stirred up a hornet's nest of armed rustlers?" Joseph smiled with the confidence of someone who had escaped from dangerous situations before. "Apache people have been disappearing into canyons when circumstances required it for more generations than you can count. I will find my way out." That evening, as they prepared for what might be the most dangerous night of their lives, Mac found himself thinking about the remarkable partnership that had developed between them over the past 3 days. He had started this journey expecting to work with a hired tracker who would help him follow a trail. Instead, he had found himself allied with a man whose courage, intelligence, and loyalty exceeded anything he could have hoped for. "Joseph," he said as they checked their weapons and made final preparations, "I want you to know that whatever happens tonight, I consider myself fortunate to have had you as a partner." The Apache tracker looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise with genuine warmth. "And I consider myself fortunate to work with a white man who judges people by their character rather than their ancestry." As they shook hands in the gathering darkness, Mac realized that their partnership had already succeeded in ways that had nothing to do with recovering stolen cattle. They had proven that men of different races and cultures could work together effectively, that mutual respect could overcome historical prejudices, and that sometimes the most unlikely alliances produced the most remarkable results. Now all they had to do was survive the night. The canyon at midnight was a place of absolute darkness and magnified sound, where every whisper of wind through the rocks seemed amplified and every footstep echoed like gunfire. Mac crouched behind a boulder at the mouth of the canyon, watching for Joseph's signal while trying to control his racing heart and sweaty palms. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Joseph would scale the canyon walls using handholds visible only to someone trained in Apache climbing techniques, then create enough chaos in the rustlers' camp to scatter the cattle. Mac would be waiting in position to drive his animals through the narrow canyon opening and out onto the open prairie, where superior knowledge of local terrain would give them an advantage over pursuing thieves. Mac had positioned himself where he could see both the camp below and the rim of the canyon above, but the darkness was so complete that he could barely make out the shapes of the penned cattle, let alone spot Joseph's progress up the vertical rock faces. For all he knew, his partner could have fallen to his death or been discovered by sentries. The waiting was the worst part. Mac had always been a man of action, someone who preferred dealing with problems directly rather than sitting in darkness wondering what was happening beyond his control. But tonight his role was to wait, watch, and be ready to move when the moment came. Then he heard a sound so subtle he almost missed it. The soft whistle of a night bird, repeated 3 times. Joseph signaled that he was in position and ready to begin the most dangerous part of their plan. What happened next occurred with stunning swiftness. A rifle shot rang out from somewhere above the camp, followed immediately by the sound of rocks tumbling down the canyon walls. Shouts erupted from the rustlers as they scrambled from their bedrolls, grabbing weapons and trying to determine the direction of the attack. Joseph had chosen his strategy perfectly. By firing from above, he had created the impression of a larger force occupying the high ground, every frontier fighter's worst nightmare. The rustlers' natural instinct was to seek cover and prepare for a siege, but their defensive positions were designed to repel attacks from the canyon mouth, not from the cliffs above. A second shot, this one from a different position, sent the cattle into the kind of panic that Mac had been counting on. Longhorns were notoriously nervous animals, and the combination of gunfire, shouting men, and the smell of fear in the air triggered their stampede instincts. The makeshift fence that penned them dissolved under the pressure of 60 frightened animals desperate to escape. Mac spurred his horse forward, riding directly into the path of the stampeding herd and using every skill he had learned in 20 years of cattle work to turn them toward the canyon mouth. Longhorns in full panic were dangerous beyond description, 1,000 pounds of muscle and horn guided by pure terror, but they were also predictable if you understood their behavior. He positioned himself at the point of the herd, becoming the lead animal they would instinctively follow, and drove them toward the narrow opening that represented their only escape route. Behind him, he could hear the rustlers shouting orders and firing wildly at shadows on the canyon rim, but their focus was on the unseen attackers above rather than the cattle escaping below. The thunder of hooves on stone was deafening as 60 head of cattle funneled through the canyon mouth and out onto the open prairie. Mac rode at their head, constantly adjusting their direction to keep them moving toward his ranch while preventing them from scattering across the landscape. It wasn't until they had covered several miles and the immediate panic of the stampede had begun to subside that Mac realized how completely their desperate plan had succeeded. Not only had he recovered his own cattle, but the confusion in the canyon had allowed him to rescue dozens of other stolen animals as well. But his satisfaction was tempered by growing worry about Joseph. The Apache tracker should have followed the cattle out of the canyon, but Mac had seen no sign of him during the chaotic escape. Either Joseph was taking a different route to avoid pursuit, or something had gone wrong with his part of the plan. Mac was torn between his responsibility to keep the recovered cattle moving toward safety and his desire to return to the canyon to search for his partner. He had just decided to leave the herd and ride back when he heard the sound of a horse approaching from the direction they had come. Joseph emerged from the darkness like a ghost, his paint stallion moving at an easy lope despite the rough country they had crossed. His clothes were torn from climbing, and Mac could see blood on his hands where sharp rocks had cut him during his descent from the canyon rim, but he was alive and apparently uninjured. "I thought you might have been captured," Mac called out as Joseph drew alongside the herd. "Close," Joseph admitted with a grin that showed white teeth in his dust-darkened face. "Closer than I would prefer. But Apache people are difficult to catch in their own country, even when that country is supposed to belong to someone else now. Did you see what happened to the rustlers? They will be very busy for the rest of the night, searching for an army of Apache warriors that does not exist and trying to round up the cattle that scattered in 4 directions." Joseph's satisfaction was evident in his voice. "By the time they realize what actually happened, we will be too far away to catch." As they drove the recovered herd through the remainder of the night, Mac found himself marveling at what they had accomplished. Against overwhelming odds, using nothing but courage, skill, and perfect teamwork, they had defeated a well-organized criminal operation and recovered a fortune in stolen livestock. But more than that, they had forged a partnership that transcended the racial and cultural boundaries that were supposed to make such cooperation impossible. Mac had learned that Apache people possessed skills and knowledge that could be invaluable to frontier ranchers, while Joseph had discovered that not all white settlers were his enemies. As dawn broke over the Texas prairie, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Mac looked at the herd they had rescued and the man who had made it all possible. This had been more than just a successful cattle recovery. It had been a proof of concept for a new kind of relationship between white settlers and Native Americans, based on mutual respect and shared benefit rather than suspicion and conflict. The question now was what they would do with the partnership they had built and the trust they had earned from each other. The return journey to Mac's ranch took 2 full days, slowed by the need to keep the recovered cattle together while watching for pursuit that never materialized. The rustlers, apparently convinced they had been attacked by a large war party, had fled the canyon and scattered to avoid what they believed was a coordinated Apache uprising. Mac used the time to sort through the recovered animals, identifying his own cattle and documenting the brands of the other stolen livestock. What he discovered was sobering. The animals bore marks from ranches across 3 territories, representing months of systematic theft by the criminal organization they had disrupted. There's enough evidence here to hang half the rustlers in Texas, Mac observed as he tallied the various brands and estimated the value of the recovered stock. Someone's going to have to contact all these ranchers and arrange for them to reclaim their animals. Joseph had been unusually quiet during the journey, and Mac suspected he was thinking about the implications of their success. They had not just recovered stolen cattle. They had exposed a criminal network that reached across territorial lines and involved corruption at multiple levels of law enforcement and government. This will bring attention, Joseph said finally as they crested the final hill before Mac's ranch came into view. Federal marshals, territorial officials, newspaper reporters, people will want to know how 2 men accomplished what official law enforcement could not. And that's a problem? Joseph's expression was thoughtful as he considered the political ramifications of their adventure. For you, probably not. You are a respected white rancher who recovered stolen property and exposed criminal activity. You will be seen as a hero. And for you, for me, it is more complicated. Apache people who cooperate too closely with white authorities are sometimes viewed with suspicion by both sides. Your people may wonder what I gained from helping you, while my people may wonder what I revealed to gain your trust. Mac had not considered these political complexities, but he could see the wisdom in Joseph's concerns. The frontier was full of people who viewed any cooperation between white settlers and Native Americans as potentially treasonous, regardless of the circumstances or outcomes. What if we kept your part in this quiet? Mac suggested. I could claim I tracked the cattle myself, or hired white trackers to help me. Joseph shook his head with a slight smile. Lies have a way of becoming more complicated than the truth they are meant to replace. Besides, I am not ashamed of what we accomplished together. Then what do you want to do? Joseph was quiet for a moment, studying the landscape of Mac's ranch spread out below them. I want to propose something that may sound impossible, but which I believe could benefit both of us and the communities we represent. I'm listening. You have proven that you can work effectively with Apache people, and you have connections to white business and government leaders that could be valuable for facilitating better relations between our peoples. Joseph turned to face Mac directly. I propose that we formalize our partnership. You need someone who understands this land and can track threats to your livestock and property. I need someone who can navigate the white legal and business systems that increasingly control Apache lives. Mac felt his pulse quicken as he began to understand the scope of what Joseph was suggesting. You're talking about a permanent arrangement? A business partnership between a white rancher and an Apache tracker? I am talking about something new. A relationship that serves the interests of both our communities while creating opportunities that neither could achieve alone. Joseph's voice carried the same intensity that had marked their midnight planning session in the canyon. Your ranch could become a safe haven for Apache people who need help dealing with government bureaucracy, while my tracking skills could help you and other ranchers protect your livestock from thieves and predators. The idea was audacious, unprecedented, and potentially dangerous for both of them. But as Mac thought about what they had accomplished together over the past week, he began to see the possibilities that such a partnership could create. What would the practical arrangements be? Mac asked, his businessman's mind already working through the logistics. I would maintain a presence on your ranch not as an employee, but as a partner in a joint enterprise. We would share resources, information, and profits from our various activities. Joseph gestured toward the recovered cattle. This recovery operation, for example, should earn us substantial rewards from the grateful ranchers whose stock we saved. Mac nodded, seeing the financial logic of the arrangement. And in return, you would provide tracking services, security consulting, and liaison work with Apache communities, among other things. I also have connections throughout the territory not just with Apache people, but with Mexican traders, railroad officials, and territorial politicians. Information and access that could be valuable for expanding your business operations. It was a compelling proposal that offered benefits Mac had never considered possible. But it also carried risks that could destroy everything he had built if their partnership was viewed as suspicious or treasonous by the wrong people. I need to think about this, Mac said honestly. Not because I doubt the value of what you're offering, but because I want to make sure I understand all the implications before we commit to something this significant. Joseph nodded, understanding. Take whatever time you need. But remember that opportunities like this do not present themselves often. and the world is changing in ways that will make such partnerships either more valuable or more dangerous depending on how quickly we act. That evening, as they settled the recovered cattle in Mac's pastures and began the process of documenting their successful recovery operation, Mac found himself thinking about the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. A week ago, he had been a solitary rancher focused entirely on recovering stolen livestock. Now he was contemplating a partnership that could transform not just his business but his entire understanding of what was possible on the changing frontier. The question was whether he had the courage to take the next step into unknown territory, both literally and figuratively. News of the cattle recovery spread across the territory faster than a prairie fire. Within a week of their return, Mac's ranch was visited by a parade of ranchers, territorial officials, and newspaper reporters, all wanting to hear first-hand accounts of how two men had accomplished what organized law enforcement had failed to achieve. Mac found himself walking a careful line in these interviews, giving credit to Joseph's tracking skills while downplaying the more dramatic aspects of their midnight raid on the Rustlers' Canyon stronghold. He presented their success as a combination of persistence, local knowledge, and good fortune rather than the carefully planned military operation it had actually been. But he couldn't hide Joseph's central role in the recovery, nor did he want to. The Apache trackers' skills had been essential to their success, and Mac felt that denying his partner's contributions would be both dishonest and ungrateful. The reaction to Joseph's involvement was mixed but generally more positive than Mac had expected. Most of the visiting ranchers were practical men who cared more about results than racial politics, and they were impressed by evidence of the tracking skills that had made the recovery possible. Several asked whether Joseph might be available to help with their own security problems. "Seems like you boys have started something," observed Henry Cartwright, a wealthy rancher from the Amarillo area who had lost 30 head of cattle to the same rustling ring. "Word's getting around that there's finally someone who can track these professional thieves." "Joseph's skills are remarkable," Mac agreed. "Best tracker I've ever seen. Would he be willing to work for other ranchers? I'd pay well for someone who could help me protect my herd." It was exactly the kind of opportunity Joseph had predicted, and Mac found himself serving as an informal agent for his partner's services, but he was careful to emphasize that any such arrangements would need to be negotiated with Joseph directly, establishing the Apache tracker as an independent professional, rather than Mac's employee. The most significant visitor came on the 10th day after their return. Marshal William Hayes arrived with a federal commission to investigate the rustling operation they had disrupted, and to coordinate the return of stolen livestock to its rightful owners. Hayes was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with the kind of sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most respected federal marshals in the Southwest. He listened to Mac's account of the cattle recovery with professional interest, asking detailed questions about the rustlers' organization and methods. This was a sophisticated operation, Hayes concluded after examining Mac's documentation of the recovered cattle. Multiple ranches hit in coordinated strikes. Livestock moved through established routes to buyers who didn't ask questions about brands. "We've been trying to crack this network for 2 years. Any idea who was behind it?" "Several ideas, but no proof until now. The evidence you've provided should be enough to roll up the entire organization, assuming we can find the men who escaped from the canyon." Hayes studied Mac carefully. "I understand you had help with this operation." An Apache tracker named Joseph Walking Bear. Mac felt a familiar tension at the mention of Joseph's name. "Yes, his skills made the recovery possible. I'd like to speak with him, if that can be arranged." The federal government is always interested in working with competent trackers, regardless of their background. The implications were significant. Federal recognition of Joseph's skills could open doors that had never been available to Apache people, but it could also expose him to dangers and pressures that Mac hadn't considered. That evening, as Mac discussed Marshal Hayes's visit with Joseph, he could see his partner weighing the opportunities and risks with the same careful analysis he had applied to their canyon raid. Federal work would provide legitimacy and protection, Joseph mused. A marshal's commission would make me officially part of the law enforcement establishment, which could be valuable for both our peoples. But it would also make me a target for Apache people who view any cooperation with federal authorities as collaboration with the enemy. And it would make me dependent on the goodwill of white officials who might withdraw their support if political winds change. Mac understood the dilemma. Joseph was being offered a chance to break new ground for Apache people in law enforcement, but accepting the offer would require him to navigate treacherous political waters that could destroy him if he made a wrong step. What's your instinct telling you? Joseph was quiet for a long time, staring out at the stars that had guided Apache people across this landscape for generations. My instinct tells me that the old ways of relating to the white world are failing. Apache people need new strategies, new alliances, and new opportunities if we are going to survive as a distinct people rather than just wards of the federal government. And you think working with the marshals could provide those opportunities? I think working with the marshals, while maintaining our partnership, could give us the legitimacy and resources to build something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds that serves the interests of both communities. 2 days later, Joseph met with Marshal Hayes in Mac's kitchen, and the conversation that followed changed the trajectory of all their lives. Hayes offered Joseph a position as a special deputy marshal with jurisdiction throughout the territory, focusing on crimes that crossed cultural and territorial boundaries. The federal government is beginning to understand that effective law enforcement on the frontier requires cooperation with indigenous communities, Hayes explained. You would be one of the first Native Americans to hold federal law enforcement authority, and your success could open similar opportunities for others. Joseph accepted the appointment with characteristic thoughtfulness, understanding that he was accepting not just a job but a responsibility to prove that Apache people could serve effectively in roles that had previously been denied to them. The formal ceremony took place a week later, with Mac serving as witness while Joseph raised his right hand and swore to uphold federal law throughout the territory. The badge he received was identical to those carried by white marshals, but its significance was revolutionary. For the first time in the history of the American West, an Apache man would have the authority to arrest white criminals and bring them before federal courts. This changes everything, Mac observed as they rode out the next morning to begin Joseph's first official investigation, reports of horse theft near the New Mexico border that might be connected to the rustling network they had disrupted. Everything, Joseph agreed. The question is whether we can manage that change in ways that benefit everyone involved, or whether the forces of fear and hatred will find ways to destroy what we're trying to build. The success of their partnership over the following months exceeded even Joseph's optimistic predictions. Working as a federal marshal with Mac's ranch serving as his unofficial headquarters, Joseph cleared more cases in 6 months than most marshals handled in 2 years. His unique combination of Apache tracking skills and federal authority made him devastatingly effective against criminals who had previously operated with impunity in the remote areas between settlements. But their most significant achievement was not in law enforcement. It was in the gradual transformation of attitudes that their partnership made possible. Ranchers who had initially been suspicious of working with an Apache marshal discovered that Joseph's knowledge of the land and its people made him invaluable for protecting their property and livestock. Apache communities that had viewed federal law enforcement as an enemy began to see Joseph as an advocate who could help them navigate the complex legal system that increasingly controlled their lives. Mac found his own role evolving as well. No longer just a rancher, he became a facilitator and translator, helping to bridge communication gaps between Joseph and white officials who had never worked with Native Americans as equals. His ranch became an informal meeting ground where representatives of different communities could come together to solve problems that affected everyone. The arrangement was tested severely when tensions erupted between Apache bands and white settlers over water rights in the drought-stricken summer of 1885. A series of confrontations had escalated to the point where military intervention seemed inevitable. With all the bloodshed and injustice that such interventions usually produced, Colonel Morrison wants to send cavalry to force the Apache bands back to the reservation, Mac reported after a meeting with territorial officials in Austin. He's convinced that any compromise with hostiles will be seen as weakness by Washington. Joseph studied the map spread across Mac's kitchen table, noting the locations where conflicts had occurred and the water sources that were at the heart of the disputes. The Apache families camped at these locations are not hostiles. They are refugees who left the reservation because government rations were insufficient to prevent starvation. They need water for their children, not war with white settlers. Can you convince them to return to the reservation voluntarily? Not unless conditions there improve dramatically. Would you return to a place where your children were slowly dying of hunger and disease? Joseph's voice carried the frustration of someone trying to find solutions to problems created by policies beyond his control. Then what's the alternative to military action? Joseph was quiet for a long time, studying the map and thinking through possibilities that might seem impossible to others, but which his unique position made conceivable. There might be a way to resolve this without bloodshed, but it would require trust from all parties and political courage from territorial officials. What kind of way? Negotiated water-sharing agreements that recognize both Apache water rights and settler irrigation needs. Formal arrangements that give Apache families legal access to traditional water sources in exchange for agreements to respect settler property and participate in territorial governance. Mac felt his pulse quicken as he began to understand the scope of what Joseph was proposing. You're talking about treaties, formal agreements between Apache bands and territorial government. I am talking about a new model for coexistence, one based on mutual benefit rather than conquest and submission. Joseph's dark eyes held the intensity that Mac had learned to associate with his partner's most ambitious plans. Your connections to territorial officials, combined with my credibility with Apache leaders, could make such negotiations possible. It was an audacious proposal that would require them to step far beyond their roles as marshal and rancher into the realm of diplomacy and political innovation. But as Mac thought about the alternative military campaigns that would destroy families on both sides while solving none of the underlying problems, he realized they had to try. The negotiations that followed were complex, delicate, and often frustrating. Mac found himself serving as an unofficial ambassador between territorial officials who had never considered treating Apache people as equals, and Apache leaders who had every reason to distrust white promises based on decades of broken official treaties and betrayed trusts. Joseph's role was even more challenging, as he had to convince Apache bands that cooperation with territorial authorities could produce better outcomes than the traditional strategies of resistance and withdrawal. His federal marshal's badge gave him credibility with white officials, but it also made him suspect among Apache people who viewed any collaboration with federal authority as potential betrayal. The breakthrough came when Chief Standing Bear, leader of the largest Apache band involved in the water disputes, agreed to meet directly with Territorial Governor Ross at Mac's ranch. The meeting was unprecedented. Never before had a territorial governor negotiated directly with Apache leadership as equals rather than as conquered enemies. The conversation that took place in Mac's parlor on a hot August afternoon was unlike anything that had occurred in the history of the American Southwest. Governor Ross, a pragmatic politician who understood that military solutions were expensive and politically risky, found himself across the table from Apache leaders whose dignity and intelligence challenged every stereotype he had absorbed about Indian peoples. "What do your people need to avoid further conflicts?" Ross asked Chief Standing Bear directly, speaking through Joseph's translation, while Mac served as witness and facilitator. "Water for our children, land where we can live without starving, recognition that we are human beings with rights under your law, not animals to be penned in reservations until we die." Standing Bear's response, delivered in Apache and translated by Joseph, carried the weight of decades of suffering and the hope for something better. The agreement they hammered out over 3 days of intensive negotiations was modest in scope but revolutionary in principle. Apache families would have legal access to specific water sources in exchange for formal agreements to respect settler property and participate in territorial legal systems. Disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than violence, with Joseph serving as an official mediator between communities. Most significantly, the agreement established Apache people as legal participants in territorial governance rather than simply subjects of federal Indian policy. It was a small step toward a new model of coexistence, but it was a step that had seemed impossible only months earlier. The water rights agreement became a model that was studied and replicated throughout the Southwest, attracting attention from federal officials, academic researchers, and newspaper reporters who wanted to understand how such unprecedented cooperation had been achieved. Mac and Joseph found themselves hosting a steady stream of visitors who came to learn about their partnership and the innovative approaches to frontier governance they had developed. But their greatest satisfaction came from the practical results of their work. Water conflicts that had threatened to explode into warfare were resolved through negotiation. Apache families gained legal recognition and protection they had never enjoyed before, and white settlers discovered that their Apache neighbors could be valuable allies rather than threatening enemies. The success of their partnership also created opportunities that neither had originally anticipated. Joseph's reputation as an effective federal marshal led to offers from railroad companies and mining corporations who needed someone with his unique combination of tracking skills and cultural knowledge to protect their interests in remote areas. Mac's role as a facilitator between communities made him valuable to territorial officials who were struggling to manage the complex ethnic and cultural dynamics of frontier society. "We could expand this," Joseph suggested one evening as they reviewed reports of their various activities over the past year. Train other Apache people as federal marshals, establish similar partnerships with ranchers in other territories, create a network of cooperation that spans the entire Southwest. Mac was intrigued by the vision but concerned about the practical challenges. That would require political support at the highest levels of territorial and federal government. Are you confident we could maintain that support if our activities grew larger and more visible? I am confident that success creates its own political support, Joseph replied. What we have accomplished here proves that cooperation between Apache people and white settlers can produce better outcomes than conflict. Expanding that model serves everyone's interests. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger carrying urgent news that would test their partnership in ways they had never anticipated. A band of Apache warriors, frustrated by the slow pace of negotiations and angered by a recent incident involving cavalry harassment of Apache families, had left the reservation and were reportedly planning raids on white settlements. Colonel Morrison is mobilizing 3 companies of cavalry, the messenger reported breathlessly. He says this is proof that negotiations with Apache are useless, and he's been authorized to use whatever force is necessary to end the threat. Mac felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications. Everything they had built over the past year could be destroyed by a single violent incident that would justify the use of military force and discredit their model of cooperative governance. Who's leading the warriors? Joseph asked quietly. Young Wolf, Chief Standing Bear's nephew. They say he's gathered maybe 20 men, all of them angry about the cavalry incident at Bitter Creek. Joseph closed his eyes for a moment, and Mac could see him weighing options that were all dangerous and potentially disastrous. Young Wolf was a respected warrior whose grievances were legitimate, but his decision to leave the reservation and threaten violence would give military hardliners the excuse they needed to abandon negotiation in favor of force. I have to go after him, Joseph said finally. Try to convince him to return to the reservation before he does something that destroys everything we've worked to build. That's suicide, Mac protested. You're a federal marshal now. Young Wolf and his warriors will see you as a traitor and an enemy. They might kill you on sight. They might. But if I don't try to stop them, Colonel Morrison's cavalry will certainly kill them, along with any Apache people who happen to be in the wrong place when the shooting starts. Joseph stood and began gathering his weapons and traveling gear. Sometimes a man has to choose between personal safety and doing what's right. Mac watched his partner prepare for what might be a final journey, feeling helpless and angry at the forces that had created this impossible situation. I'm coming with you, Number. This is something I have to do as an Apache man talking to other Apache men. Your presence would make Young Wolf more suspicious, not less. Then what can I do? Joseph paused in his preparations and looked at Mac with an expression that held both gratitude and determination. Delay Colonel Morrison as long as possible. Use your political connections, your relationships with territorial officials, anything that might buy me time to find Young Wolf and convince him to surrender before the cavalry finds him first. It was a desperate plan that required both men to risk everything they had built for the slim chance of preventing a massacre that would destroy their model of cooperation and return the region to the cycle of violence they had worked so hard to break. As Joseph rode out into the darkness toward an uncertain confrontation with Apache warriors who might kill him as a traitor, Mac saddled his own horse and rode toward the territorial capital, where he would use every connection and favor he had accumulated to delay a military campaign that seemed inevitable. Both men understood that they were gambling with their lives and their life's work, but they also understood that some things were worth any risk to preserve. Mac's desperate race to the territorial capital took him through 2 days and nights of hard riding across country he knew like the back of his hand. He pushed his horse to the limits of endurance, switching to remounts at friendly ranches and stopping only when absolutely necessary for rest. He arrived in Austin to find the territorial government in crisis mode, with military officials demanding immediate authorization for a massive campaign against hostile Apache, while civilian authorities worried about the political and financial costs of another Indian war. Mac's reputation as someone who understood Apache affairs got him immediate meetings with key officials, but the conversations were difficult and the outcome uncertain. Morrison is convinced that negotiation has failed, Governor Ross told Mac during a private meeting in the Capitol building. He has reports of Apache warriors gathering weapons and making threatening statements about attacking white settlements. The federal government is pressuring me to authorize military action before American citizens are killed. Governor, those reports are exaggerated by people who want to see negotiations fail, Mac argued with the passion of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance. Young Wolf has legitimate grievances about cavalry harassment of Apache families. If those grievances were addressed through proper channels instead of military force, this crisis could be resolved without bloodshed. And if you're wrong, if I delay military action and Apache raids result in civilian deaths, my political career is over, and I'll be personally responsible for those deaths. Mac understood the governor's dilemma, but he also understood that military campaigns had a way of creating the very problems they were supposed to solve. Governor, give me 72 hours. If Joseph can't find young Wolf and convince him to surrender voluntarily, then authorize Morrison's campaign. But 72 hours might prevent a war that could last for years and cost hundreds of lives. It was a desperate request, but Governor Ross was a man who understood the value of avoiding military conflicts if possible. After consulting with his advisors and extracting promises from Mac to take personal responsibility for the delay, he agreed to postpone the cavalry campaign for 3 days. Meanwhile, Joseph was tracking young Wolf's band through country that had been his childhood playground but was now patrolled by cavalry units with orders to shoot Apache warriors on sight. Using skills learned from his grandfather and refined through years of federal law enforcement work, he followed the warriors' trail through canyons and mesas, where white soldiers would never think to look. He found them on the second day, camped in a hidden valley where Apache bands had taken refuge for generations. Young Wolf's 20 warriors were indeed preparing for raids, but their equipment was pathetic old rifles, limited ammunition, and horses that were already showing signs of exhaustion. They were brave men driven by desperation rather than professional raiders planning systematic attacks. Joseph approached their camp alone and on foot, carrying his rifle openly but pointed toward the ground in the traditional gesture of peaceful intent. The warriors saw him coming from half a mile away, and by the time he reached their fire, they were arranged in a semicircle with weapons ready and expressions that mixed suspicion with curiosity. Young Wolf was a man in his late 20s with the kind of lean, weathered build that marked the finest Apache warriors. His dark eyes held intelligence and anger in equal measure, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned his leadership through courage and skill. "Joseph Walking Bear," he said in Apache, using the formal tones reserved for addressing equals, "the Apache who wears the white man's badge and serves the white man's law. Have you come to arrest us? I have come to talk with you as one Apache to another, away from badges and laws, and the anger that clouds our judgment when we think only of revenge." Joseph settled into a comfortable squat that indicated he was prepared for a long conversation. "I have come to ask you to consider what your actions will mean for our people, not just today but for generations to come." What followed was a conversation that lasted through the night and into the following day, with Joseph using every argument, every story, and every piece of wisdom he had learned from elders and experience to convince young Wolf that violence would destroy more than it could possibly achieve. He spoke of the water rights agreements that had given Apache families legal access to resources they needed for survival. He described the changes in territorial governance that recognized Apache people as legal participants rather than mere subjects. He painted a vision of a future where Apache children could grow up with opportunities that had been denied to their parents. "And what of our honor?" young Wolf demanded. "What of the insults and harassment that cavalry soldiers heap on our women and elders? Are we to accept those because white law protects the soldiers who commit them?" "No," Joseph replied firmly. "We are to use white law to punish soldiers who break it, just as white law punishes Apache people who break it. That is what equality means. The same laws apply to everyone, and everyone has the same right to justice." It was a radical concept that challenged traditional Apache approaches to justice and honor, but it was also a practical strategy that acknowledged the reality of their situation. Apache people could not win a military conflict with the United States, but they might be able to win legal and political conflicts if they learned to use the white man's systems effectively. The debate continued through a second night, with Joseph gradually winning support from warriors who had followed young Wolf out of loyalty rather than conviction. By dawn of the third day, the band was split between those who wanted to return to the reservation and those who insisted that honor demanded they continue their planned raids. Young Wolf himself remained torn between his desire for revenge and his growing understanding that Joseph's arguments made strategic sense. The decision that would determine the fate of Apache-white relations throughout the Southwest rested in the hands of a young warrior whose choice would affect far more people than just those sitting around the dying campfire in the hidden valley. The moment of truth came when young Wolf stood up from the council fire and looked out at the desert landscape where his ancestors had lived for centuries before white men arrived with their laws, their soldiers, and their promises that were broken as easily as they were made. Joseph Walking Bear speaks wisdom that I do not want to hear, young Wolf said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that no young man should have to make. He tells us that the old ways of defending our honor will destroy our future, and in my heart, I know he speaks truth. The young war leader turned to face his followers, 20 brave men who had been willing to follow him into what they all knew would probably be a final battle against impossible odds. But I also know that a man who accepts insults to his family without response is not worthy to be called Apache. Joseph felt his heart sink as he heard the words that seemed to indicate young Wolf would reject compromise in favor of a warrior's death that would accomplish nothing but the destruction of everything they had worked to build. But young Wolf was not finished speaking. Therefore, I propose a different path, one that honors our ancestors while protecting our children. The young warrior's eyes met Joseph's directly. We will return to the reservation, but not as defeated men crawling back to beg forgiveness. We will return as Apache warriors who choose to fight our enemies with new weapons, white man's law, white man's courts, and white man's politics. The words sent a ripple of surprise and discussion through the gathered warriors. This was not surrender, but it was not the traditional revenge raid they had planned either. It was something entirely new, a strategic decision to fight injustice through legal and political means rather than bullets and arrows. You ask us to trust in justice from people who have shown us no justice, observed Grey Horse, one of young Wolf's most trusted followers. I ask you to trust in our ability to make justice happen by learning to use their systems better than they do, young Wolf replied. Joseph Walking Bear has shown us that an Apache man can carry federal authority and use it to protect our people. Perhaps it is time for more Apache men to learn such skills. The debate that followed was intense but respectful, with each warrior speaking his mind about the choice between traditional warfare and this new form of strategic cooperation. By afternoon, a consensus had emerged they would return to the reservation, but they would also demand formal investigation of the cavalry harassment that had triggered their departure. Joseph felt a mixture of relief and pride as he rode out of the hidden valley with young Wolf's band, knowing that they had chosen a path that preserved both Apache honor and Apache lives. But he also understood that this was only the beginning of a much longer struggle to transform the relationship between Apache people and the American governmental system. The return to the reservation was triumphant rather than defeated. Young Wolf's warriors rode in formation, carrying their weapons openly and singing traditional songs that celebrated their courage and wisdom in choosing a difficult but honorable path. Word of their return spread quickly, and by the time they reached the reservation boundaries, they were met by hundreds of Apache people who had heard about their decision to pursue justice through legal means rather than warfare. Mac was waiting at the reservation headquarters, having ridden hard from Austin after receiving Joseph's message about the successful negotiations. The relief on his face when he saw both Joseph and young Wolf alive and unharmed was evident to everyone present. Colonel Morrison is not pleased, Mac reported quietly to Joseph as they watched young Wolf formally surrender his weapons to reservation officials. He was looking forward to a military campaign that would have enhanced his reputation and his career prospects. Colonel Morrison will have other opportunities to enhance his reputation, Joseph replied with dry satisfaction, preferably ones that don't involve massacring Apache families. The formal investigation that followed young Wolf's complaints about cavalry harassment produced results that surprised even Joseph with their thoroughness and fairness. The territorial government, having committed itself to a policy of legal resolution rather than military action, was determined to prove that Apache people could receive justice through proper channels. 3 cavalry officers were court-martialed for unauthorized harassment of Apache families, and new regulations were established to prevent similar incidents in the future. Young Wolf himself was offered a position as a tribal police officer, giving him official authority to protect Apache rights within the reservation system. But the most significant outcome was the formal recognition of Joseph and Mac's partnership as a model for frontier governance that balanced the interests of different communities while maintaining law and order. Their success in preventing what could have been a devastating war made them valuable resources for territorial officials who were struggling to manage similar conflicts throughout the Southwest. 5 years later, Joseph Walking Bear had become the first Apache man ever appointed as a federal judge, presiding over cases that involved both Apache and white disputants. His courtroom was known throughout the territory for fairness, wisdom, and innovative solutions to problems that had previously seemed intractable. Mac's ranch had evolved into something unprecedented, a training center where young Apache men learned legal and business skills while white settlers learned about Apache culture and traditional knowledge. Their partnership had produced not just successful law enforcement and conflict resolution, but a new model for education and cultural exchange. But their greatest achievement was visible in the children who played together around Mac's ranch house, Apache, and white youngsters who grew up seeing cooperation and mutual respect as normal rather than exceptional. These children would become the leaders of a new generation that understood diversity as strength rather than division. As Joseph stood on the porch of the house he now shared with Mac's extended family, watching his own son play with Mac's adopted Apache daughter, he reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them from that first desperate cattle recovery to their current roles as architects of a new kind of American community. "Did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" Mac asked, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the easy companionship of men who had shared danger, success, and the satisfaction of building something meaningful together. Joseph accepted the coffee and smiled with the contentment of a man who had found his purpose and fulfilled it beyond his wildest dreams. "I imagined that we might recover your cattle and perhaps establish a useful business relationship. I never imagined that we would change the way 2 peoples think about each other. And now I think we have proven that the future belongs to people who choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear, and hope over hatred." Joseph raised his cup in a toast to unlikely partnerships and their unexpected results as they drank their coffee in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape that had become home to both their peoples. Mac and Joseph knew that they had accomplished something that would outlast their own lives. They had proven that Apache and cowboy, tracker and rancher, federal marshal and territorial citizen could work together to build something better than either could achieve alone. The children playing in their yard would carry that lesson forward into the 20th century, creating a legacy of cooperation and understanding that would help heal the wounds of the frontier era and build a more inclusive vision of what America could become. The end.